Hello and welcome everyone to the Polity Primer series of Drishti IAS. My name is Pragya and today we are going to discuss a topic which has been in the news in the past as well and is being highly debated in the current news as well. The title of our today's discussion is Removal of the words Socialist and Secular from the Preamble of our Indian Constitution. In this discussion, we will be studying about the Preamble of our Indian Constitution. We'll also understand what is socialism and how was it added to the preamble of our Indian Constitution. We'll also understand the concept of secularism. We'll also analyze the ongoing debate around them. And in the end, we are going to see a practice question for your prelims examination and a practice question for your mains examination. So now let us proceed to understand the background of our today's topic. So if we talk about the background of our today's topic, it has been alleged by the leader of the Congress that when the new parliament building was being inaugurated, the copies of the constitution which was supplied to them did not contain the word socialist and secular in it. So it is being alleged that the word socialist and secular was missing from the copies of the constitution that were provided to them. So in this background, let us understand what is the preamble to our Indian Constitution and how these words socialist and secular were added to our Indian preamble. So if we talk about the text of the preamble of our Indian Constitution, it states that we the people of India, so who is supreme in India? The people of the India. Having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic and to secure to all of its citizens justice, liberty and equality in our Constituent Assembly this 26th day of November 1949. So this is basically the adoption day of our Indian Constitution. And we celebrate this date of 26 November 1949 as the Constitution Day. Constitution Day or the Samvidhan Divas. So we celebrate this as Constitution Day or Samvidhan Divas every year. And if we talk about the enforcement date of our Indian Constitution, it is 26th January 1950. So 26 January 1950 is the enforcement date of our Indian Constitution or the date on which the Indian Constitution came into force. So if we talk about the meaning of this term preamble, so in very layman terms or in very simple terms, it is an introduction or the preface to the Indian Constitution. It contains all of the foundational or the values which form the bedrock of our Indian Constitution. So all of the values such as political, religious, social are contained in the preamble of the Indian Constitution. And the preamble of the Indian Constitution was brought by the Objectives Resolution which was given by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. So the philosophy underlying the constitution or the preamble of the constitution was explained by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru in his Objective Resolutions which was later adopted as the preamble to our Indian Constitution. And though preamble is not justiciable in nature, so what do we understand by this term justiciable in nature? So you cannot go to the courts and ask that this ideal mentioned in the preamble has been violated, now take an action. So this is not going to happen. The courts are not empowered to take an action. But the preamble does serves an important aid of interpretation. So whenever the courts are interpreting the constitution and they get confused that what was the intention of the makers of the constitution, they go back to the preamble to interpret the provision. So preamble is a very important part of our Indian Constitution. And the best and an interesting part about preamble is that it was adopted after whole of the constitution was enacted. And if we talk about where the preamble as a whole has been borrowed from, It has been borrowed from the US Constitution. So the preamble as a whole has been borrowed from the US Constitution, and it is an important part of our Indian Constitution. Preamble is a part of our Indian Constitution, has been interpreted by the Supreme Court. And what does this mean? This means that the Parliament has an amending power over the preamble as well. So far preamble has been amended just once, and that is by the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act of 1976. So this was all about the importance of preamble and the meaning of the term preamble. Now let us understand the concept of socialism and how it came to be inserted in the preamble of our Indian Constitution. So if we talk about the meaning of this term socialism in very simple terms, it means that the means of production and property is in the hands of the public and it is not nationalized. So this is a difference, this is the whole idea of socialism, that who is controlling the means of production and the property, the public is controlling it. And this draws a distinction between socialism and capitalism. So what is capitalism? Capitalism is the ownership of the private persons. In capitalism, the means of production and distribution are concentrated in the hands of the rich people, and that is why we say in capitalist economy the rich get richer but the poor gets poorer. And if we talk about the ancient idea of socialism and where did we take this idea from, so we took this idea from Plato's Republic. So Plato's idea of republic. And Plato believed in a collective society. He said that means of production and distribution should not only be concentrated in one hand, it should be equally distributed amongst the people in the society. So in the 18th and the 19th century, after the Industrial Revolution happened in the Europe was reeling with the side effects of capitalism, and that led to the birth of socialism. So who were the propounders of socialism? They were Karl Marx, Lenin, and Karl Marx talked about an ideal state of society such as the classless society. So in the concept of Karl Marx, the society should be classless. But this is not so. This is a very ideal concept and we have not been able to achieve it as of now. So if we talk about socialism, it was very popular in the USSR as well. And the definition of socialism was given by Lenin. So if we talk about the birth of socialism in India or the Indian socialism, so Indian socialism evolved as a political movement in the early 20th century in opposition to the land revenue settlement system which was imposed by the Britishers. So before independence in India, the archaic land revenue settlement systems were followed by the Britishers, and as an agitation against this system, the concept of socialism was born. And after independence, the Congress party itself adopted a resolution to establish a socialist pattern of society in its Avdi session as early as in 1955 and took measures to implement socialism in India. So socialism was present in India before independence and after independence as well. So if we talk about the historical background of this adding of the term socialist in the preamble of our constitution, the Indira Gandhi government was existing during after independence, and she wanted to propagate that her government is pro-poor or her government follows the ideas of socialism. Why? Because her election was cancelled by the Allahabad High Court due to malpractices. So she wanted to become a popular prime minister. And her cancellation of election led to the imposition of emergency in our country. So it was her emergency government which was trying to popularize this idea of socialism. And the term socialism was added by her emergency government to the preamble by the 42nd Amendment Act of 1976. 1976. So this is also known as the mini constitution of India. So she was trying to make a lot of changes in the constitution of India, and one of the change was adding the word socialist in the preamble of the Indian constitution. So it is not so that we were not socialist before that. So even before this word was added in the Indian constitution, we were a socialist state, we were a welfare state. And why I am saying so? Because we had the directive principles of state policy. And so what are these directive principles of state policy? It obligates the state to act as a welfare state. So the concept of socialism was present even before it was made explicit in the preamble of the Indian constitution, and it made explicit what was already implicit. The constitution makers were cognizant that India was going to be a socialist state, and that is why they added a directive principles of state policy. And when this was being debated on the floor of the Constituent Assembly, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar said that if we'll put it explicitly in our Indian constitution, that would narrow down the concept, because the concept will evolve with time, with circumstances, and that is why he just inserted the directive principles of state policy and not the word socialist explicitly. The Indian brand of socialism is a democratic socialism. So what do we understand by this term democratic socialism? In democratic socialism, the private parties and the public infrastructure coexist with each other. But this is not the case with communist socialism. In communist socialism, there is a nationalization of the distribution and the production of the means of production, and there is an abolition of the private property. So in democratic socialism, the private rights and the public properties coexist with each other, but this is not the case with communist socialism, which was being followed by the USSR at that point of time. So this is how our Indian socialism differs from the idea of Western socialism. So if we talk about this term secularism, so if we understand this term secularism in very simple terms, so what do we understand by this term secularism? Why do we state that we are secular? So secularism is absence of a state religion. It is in completely opposite to theocratic states. In theocratic states, we see that the state have a religion of its own. For example, Saudi Arabia, for example, Pakistan. But this is not the case in secularism. In secularism, the state maintains an impartiality, or there is no state religion. The state promotes all of the religions equally. So this word secularism is not defined in our Indian constitution, but it is a part of the basic structure of the constitution. As has been held by the Supreme Court in the Keshwanand Bharati case. So if we talk about how was this term secular added to the preamble of our Indian constitution, it was added by the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act of 1976 by the emergency government of the Indira Gandhi. And Indian secularism is very different from the Western secularism. In Indian secularism, the state protects all of the religion. It is unbiased. It does not say that, okay, I'll promote one religion and I'll downgrade another religion. So there is no concept of state religion in Indian secularism. In fact, if we talk about Indian secularism, it talks about the relationship of a human being with a human being, and not with the human being with God. What do we understand by this? That when we talk about secularism, we associate it to the religion of a person. So in Indian secularism, this does not happen. It talks about the relationship between a human being with another human being, not of religion, not of a relationship between a man and a god. And that is why secularism in India is not a question of religion. Instead, it is a question of law. The Supreme Court has observed that although the word secular state were not expressly mentioned in the constitution, there can be no doubt that constitution makers wanted to establish such a state. Why? Because the makers were cognizant that there is a religious diversity in India, and state cannot have a state religion. It will have to protect all of the religions, especially the minorities, and that is why they inserted articles 25 to 28 in our Indian constitution, which talks about religious freedom. So the religious freedom in the Indian constitution gives a right to every citizen of India to freely practice, propagate and profess their religion, and it also protects the religious minorities in India. So that is why we say that all of these sentiments of secularism, socialism were already implicit in our Indian constitution. So the Amendment Act, which has inserted the words socialism and secularism, has made explicit what was already implicit. Our founding members were cognizant of the fact that India is a secular state, India is a socialist state. So what is the ongoing debate around the interpretation or the removal of these terms socialist and secular from the preamble of India? So if we talk about the debate states that the words socialist and secular are not part of the original constitution, so that is why they should be removed. So the critics argue that as these words were not the part of Indian constitution, they have been added by way of an amendment, they should be removed. In fact, a petition was filed by former BJP MP Subramaniam Swamy in the Supreme Court, and he sought that the removal of words socialist and secular from the preamble, and they are giving this contention that it was not mentioned in the original constitution, but it is not the case. As I was explaining this before also, our founding fathers were cognizant of this fact that India was a socialist state, India was a welfare state. That is why they inserted directive principles of state policy. That is why they have given us the right to religious freedom. We have a right to freely propagate, practice and profess our religion. They also protected the religious minorities. It is just that they did not feel the need of making them explicit. They felt that when the time was right and the concept should change as per the changing scenario. And if they will put it down explicitly in the Indian constitution, then it will be subject to a very narrow interpretation, and they wanted the interpretation to be wide, and that is why they chose not to put them in the Indian constitution. So even if there is a debate that is going on that these words are removed, what will we do now? They forget that the articles of our Indian constitution and the basic philosophy of our Indian constitution makes it very implicit in our Indian constitution. So this is not something that can be removed. Only the words can be removed, not the ideology. And people are failing to understand this. In 2008, the Supreme Court had rejected a plea demanding the removal of the term socialist. Even the Supreme Court is not in favor. Whenever anyone approaches the Supreme Court, for example, in 2020 also a BJP MP approached the Supreme Court, though the petition is still pending, but I don't think so the Supreme Court is also in favor of removing these words from the preamble of the constitution. The moot question is that these words socialist and secular form the part of the basic structure of our Indian constitution. And as we were discussing in the basic structure lecture, that Parliament do not have amending powers over the basic structure of our Indian constitution. So the question is, how will the Parliament be able to remove it? If the Parliament does not have the power to amend the basic structure of the constitution, that means it cannot vary or remove these terms socialist and secular from the preamble of the Indian constitution. Only time can tell what will happen, that whether these words will be removed, how will they be removed, and or whether it is a propaganda against the ruling party just because the Lok Sabha elections are round the corner. With this, we come to a conclusion of our today's discussion. We have seen what is the preamble of our Indian constitution. We have also analyzed the terms socialism and secularism. We have also understood the ongoing debate around them. Now let us see a practice question for your prelims examination. Consider the following questions. Your statement number 1 is preamble is justiciable in nature. Your statement number 2 is the words secularism and socialism were added in the preamble by the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act of 1976. Which of the statements given above are correct? Your options are option A, 1 only, option 2, 2 only, option C is 1 and 2, both the statements are correct, and option D is none of the statements given above are correct. Kindly drop your answer in the comment box below. Now let us see a practice question for your mains examination. So the question is, preamble is the philosophical key to the constitution, examine. So in the introduction you can explain what is preamble. You can also write about how it lays down the fundamental or the core values of our Indian constitution. Then you will talk about, in the body you will talk about the interpretation of the preamble as a part of the Indian constitution through different judgments of the Supreme Court, and then you can conclude that why is preamble important and how it opens the door to the Indian constitution, and you can also mention some of the important statements given by our honorable people for the preamble, such as K.M. Munshi states that preamble is the horoscope of our Indian constitution. So you can mention these important statements in the conclusion and conclude your answer. I hope this session was insightful for you. If you found the today's discussion helpful, kindly like the video and subscribe to our channel for more such updates. If you have any feedback regarding this session, kindly drop it in the comment box below. Thank you.